Hey, everybody. Ready for a deep dive into something super interesting? We're going to be looking at periconception health today.
Periconception health.
Yeah. And get this, we've got this excerpt from a textbook on assisted reproductive techniques that a listener sent in. I think you're going to be amazed by how much there is to learn about this stage. It's way more than just, the basic pregnancy prep. We're going to be talking about how to really optimize both parents' health, like even before conception.
That is interesting. It's kind of funny that for so long everyone has only focused on the pregnancy itself.
Yeah.
But really, if you want to have a healthy baby, it all starts so much earlier.
Okay.
And it's not just about the mother's health either. I mean, we're
Yeah.
talking about the health of both the egg and the sperm.
Oh, wow.
How healthy those two cells are really translates into the best possible start for the embryo.
So, are we talking about setting the stage, kind of like before a play starts, before the curtain even rises?
You got it. Exactly. And this excerpt that we're looking at, it actually gets into the science behind that stage setting. It talks about this concept called developmental competence in eggs and sperm.
Okay. Developmental competence. I've never heard that term.
So essentially, it refers to the cell's ability to successfully, fertilize in the first place, and then implant and develop into a healthy embryo.
Okay. So it's not just like whether or not the sperm can reach the egg.
Right.
It's like how healthy they are to begin with.
Yes, how strong and healthy the cells are to begin with.
Wow. But I guess where I'm getting a little confused is how much does the father's health actually matter when it comes to the egg? I mean, the egg is in the mother's body, right?
That's true. But here's where it gets really interesting. The textbook talks about how the father's health, believe it or not, can actually influence the environment where that egg is fertilized and then implants. Like, for example, a father's diet, or even his exposure to certain environmental factors. These things can actually change the composition of his seminal fluid, which then interacts with the woman's reproductive system.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying what the father eats could actually affect the environment inside the mother's body where the embryo first starts to grow? I would never have thought of that.
It really is all connected, you
Right.
see.
Okay, so that brings us to this question then. Why is this period, this periconception period, so important?
Okay, well, the textbook describes this really fascinating concept. It's called developmental plasticity.
Developmental plasticity.
Hmm.
Plasticity makes me think of something that's flexible, like those bendy straws, but we're talking about an embryo, so help me out here.
Well, you're on the right track with that flexibility idea.
Okay.
Because what developmental plasticity means is that in those very early stages, the embryo is incredibly adaptable. It can sense its surroundings, like the environment that it's in, and actually adjust how it develops accordingly.
So it's almost like the embryo is taking stock of its situation and making decisions about the best way to grow based on what it's sensing in its environment.
It is. Isn't that fascinating?
So what kind of things is the embryo actually detecting at this stage?
It can detect all kinds of things. The textbook mentions things called cytokines and growth factors.
Cytokines and growth factors.
You can think of them like chemical messengers
Mm.
that give the embryo information about its environment.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just the genes dictating how the embryo develops. It's also these environmental cues from the mother.
Exactly. It's remarkable, really.
But I think earlier you mentioned something about this adaptability, this plasticity, having a potential downside.
Oh, yeah. That's a really, really important point.
What do you mean by that?
It's something that the authors of the textbook emphasize, too. While it's true that this adaptability is generally a good thing, it allows the embryo to survive in a variety of conditions.
Right.
But sometimes it can actually lead to trade-offs. In other words, sometimes the embryo will prioritize just immediate survival, even if that means potentially compromising its long-term health.
So is it kind of like taking a shortcut that gets you where you need to go faster, but maybe on a bumpy road?
Oh, that is a perfect analogy. You're good at this.
Thanks.
So yeah, the embryo might adapt to an environment that's not ideal to survive in the short term, but this could have lasting consequences down the road, even long after birth. For instance, this early adaptation could affect the number and types of cells that end up forming in various tissues.
Oh, wow.
Or even how the embryo's genes are regulated, a concept that we call epigenetics.
Epigenetics. That sounds kind of complicated. Is that are we talking about genes being turned on or off?
Yeah, pretty much. Epigenetics is basically the study of how genes are expressed, meaning how they're turned on or off, but without any changes to the actual DNA sequence itself.
Okay.
And you know what? The environment can actually play a huge role in shaping these epigenetic patterns,
Right.
especially during early development.
So even subtle things like during this periconception period
Yeah.
could end up having a ripple effect for years to come because they're influencing how the embryo's genes are actually expressed.
Yes, precisely. And to illustrate this, I wanted to bring up one of the key diagrams from the textbook.
Okay.
It's figure 34.1. It shows how an embryo that's basically forced to adapt to a difficult environment, a stressful environment, might end up being born with what they call reduced functional capacity.
Hmm. So are we talking about things that might not be immediately obvious at birth, but that could maybe show up as health issues later in life?
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
And, this impact can be seen all over, like in the cardiovascular system, the immune system, even mental health.
Wow. We hear a lot about the importance of a healthy pregnancy, but this really highlights just how much influence those weeks and months before conception can have.
Couldn't agree more. And, there's another really crucial area that's impacted during this time, placental development.
Okay, the placenta. So remind me what the placenta does again.
So the placenta is the lifeline between the mother and the developing fetus.
Oh, right.
It's responsible for all kinds of important stuff, like delivering nutrients and oxygen and removing waste products.
Okay, so if this periconception period is really stressful or the environment isn't that great, could that affect how the placenta develops?
It definitely could, yeah. And actually, I think figure 34.2 is just so interesting
Figure 34.2.
because it shows how all of these things we've been talking about, like, genes, lifestyle, environment,
Right.
even pre-existing reproductive disorders in the mother can all work together, can all come together to influence not just the embryo's development, but also the formation of the placenta.
So I'm really starting to see just how interconnected everything is here.
Right.
It's not just about, like, individual choices that the parents make, but about the broader environment and even pre-existing conditions that they may have. I guess what I'm wondering now is about some of the specific things that people might be exposed to during this time. I mean, we all know about the big ones like, smoking and alcohol.
Right, those are definitely big factors.
All right.
But this textbook also talks about things that maybe aren't so obvious, like exposure to environmental pollutants.
Pollutants, you mean like air pollution and things like
Means
that?
air pollution. But it's more than just air pollution.
Oh, okay.
We're talking about a whole bunch of chemicals. I mean, they can be in our food, our water, even personal care products, and even just like household dust.
So even if you're, pretty careful about living a healthy lifestyle, you could still be exposed to some of these harmful chemicals without even knowing it.
Yeah, that's unfortunately the case for a lot of people. And some of these chemicals are particularly worrisome.
Oh, how so?
Well, because they act as what we call endocrine disruptors.
Endocrine disruptors. Okay,
Yeah.
that sounds kind of scary. What exactly are those?
Basically, they're chemicals that interfere with your body's hormonal system.
Okay, and hormones regulate so many different things in the body.
They do, yeah, including reproduction.
Right.
So endocrine disruptors can actually mimic or block hormones, and that can lead to all kinds of problems.
Like what?
Well, fertility issues for one, and even developmental problems in offspring, the children.
Gosh, this is starting to feel a little overwhelming, like a minefield almost.
I know what you mean. It can feel that way.
Yeah.
But I think the good news is that knowledge is power,
Yeah.
By understanding what the potential risks are, we can make smarter choices to reduce our exposure and protect ourselves and our future families.
So it's about like taking control of what we can and minimizing those risks.
You got it. And this textbook that we're looking at, it actually goes into some specific steps that people, individuals and couples can take to do just that. But before we get into those specific steps, I think there's another factor we should talk about that can play a role in all of this: pre-existing reproductive disorders.
That makes sense. So if someone's already dealing with something like PCOS or endometriosis, that obviously just adds another layer of complexity to everything.
Oh, absolutely. Those kinds of conditions, they can just make it so much more challenging for conception and early development.
Yeah.
And even the use of assisted reproductive technologies, while those technologies are amazing and have helped so many people, it can also introduce some unique things to consider.
So even RT, like IVF, could potentially add stress to the embryo during this really critical time.
That's a possibility that the textbook authors actually bring up. The process of IVF, while it is just a wonder of modern science, it does involve manipulating the embryo outside of the mother's body.
Right.
And that could introduce some stress.
I guess it's a reminder that even with all the advances that we've made in reproductive medicine, there's still so much that we're learning.
Yeah, we're just scratching the surface when it comes to early human development.
It's pretty amazing. Okay, well, I think that's a good place to take a pause for now. We've covered so much
We have.
from like the tiniest cellular level all the way up to the societal level.
Yeah. It's been a really good overview.
But, we've only just scratched the surface of this topic.
There is so much more to talk about.
There is. So stay tuned, everybody. We'll be right back. We'll have more of our deep dive into periconception health right after the break. Welcome back, everybody. I'm still thinking about all that stuff we talked about in the first part of this deep dive. It's pretty amazing, right?
Is.
Who knew that, like, what the father eats could actually impact the environment where the embryo first starts to grow?
It really highlights how interconnected everything is.
It really does. So before the break, we were talking about the role of healthcare providers in all of this.
Right.
It seems like doctors and nurses could be a lot more proactive about educating their patients in this area.
I think so too.
Yeah.
And, the textbook we're looking at actually gives some specific advice for how healthcare providers can work preconception care into their everyday practice.
Okay.
Like, for example, figure 34.3 is a really helpful visual guide.
See 34.3.
It shows how to go about assessing and managing lifestyle factors with a patient.
So it's like a cheat sheet for healthcare providers to help their patients prepare for pregnancy.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. It covers pretty much everything you can think of. Like taking a really detailed medical history, talking about diet and exercise, managing stress, thinking about environmental toxins.
Wow.
There are even some recommendations for lab tests and screenings that might be helpful.
That's really great. I can imagine that would be really empowering for patients,
I think so too.
to have that kind of structured guidance from their doctor or nurse.
Right. It takes away some of the guesswork,
Yeah.
gives you a clear path forward.
Yeah, exactly. But speaking of things to be concerned about, one thing that I'm still kind of stuck on is those environmental pollutants we talked about.
Ah, yeah. Endocrine disrupting chemicals.
Yeah, exactly. Could you maybe talk a bit more about the specific risks from those?
Sure. So the textbook talks about endocrine disruptors in detail, like we talked about before. These chemicals, they mess with your hormones.
Right.
They can mimic or block hormones, which throws off your body's normal signaling.
Okay.
And this can affect a whole bunch of systems, but especially reproductive health.
So we're not just talking about problems getting pregnant, but also possible problems for the baby's health later on.
That's right. And the scary thing is that the research on these endocrine disruptors is showing that they could be a factor in a whole bunch of different issues. We're talking everything from, early puberty to certain kinds of cancer to even neurodevelopmental problems.
Wow, that
Yeah.
is pretty scary.
Yeah.
Are there any specific endocrine disruptors that people should really be keeping an eye out for?
There are quite a few, but I'd say some of the most common ones, the ones that have been studied the most, are BPA, phthalates, and pesticides.
Okay, so BPA, phthalates, and pesticides.
Yeah.
And just to remind me, where are those found?
Well, BPA is in some plastics and food packaging.
Okay,
Phthalates are often used to soften plastic, so you'll find them in personal care products. And pesticides, obviously, they can contaminate our food and water.
right. So I guess it sounds like reading labels really carefully and just being more aware of the things we're using and consuming is really important.
Absolutely. And that's not all you can do. You can also filter your water, choose organic produce whenever possible, and be really careful about the cleaning products that you use at home.
Right. So it's all about just minimizing those risks.
Exactly. And remember, it's not just about the individual choices that we make.
Right.
It's also about, being an advocate for better regulations and policies that help protect us from these harmful chemicals.
Absolutely. It takes a village to make a change.
It does, but I want to switch gears for a second and get back to the topic of assisted reproductive technology, RT. You mentioned earlier that even IVF could potentially be stressful for the embryo.
I did. And that really surprised me. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. So IVF, it's obviously an amazing technology, but it does require taking the embryo out of the mother's body and manipulating it.
Right.
And there's some concern that this manipulation could actually affect the embryo's epigenetics. Like we talked about before, epigenetics is how the genes are expressed.
Right.
And even though IVF is designed to be as safe and controlled as possible, there might be some subtle things happening that we don't even realize yet.
I see. So even though IVF is a huge help for a lot of people, there are still some things we're learning about how it might affect the embryo.
That's right. And I don't want to scare anyone who is thinking about or has gone through IVF. I just want to point out that there's always more to learn, and we should be doing everything we can to create the best possible environment for the embryo.
Right, it's not about fear-mongering. It's just about understanding all the different aspects.
Absolutely. And keep in mind that IVF is changing all the time. Scientists are constantly working to improve it and make it even safer.
That's good to know. One of the things that this textbook really emphasized was the 5 stages of human reproduction. It made me realize that preconception health isn't just about the moment of conception. It's about everything that leads up to it.
Absolutely. And each of those stages is really important for the healthy development of the baby.
Do you mind reminding me what the 5 stages are again?
Yeah.
I'm having a little trouble remembering.
Not at all. So first you have gametogenesis.
Gametogenesis.
That's when the sperm and egg cells are formed.
Right.
Then there's fertilization. That's when the sperm and egg come together.
Okay.
Then implantation. That's when the fertilized egg, which we call a zygote, attaches to the lining of the uterus.
Right.
Then we have embryogenesis, where the embryo develops from a single cell into a complex multicellular organism. And finally, placentation. That's when the placenta is formed.
All of that in just a few short weeks. It's incredible.
It is. And all those stages are influenced by things like genetics, lifestyle, and environmental exposures. And that's why preconception care is so important. It's all about giving the embryo the best possible chance to develop healthily at every stage.
It's like a chain reaction, right?
Yes.
Each stage builds on the one before it, and if there's a problem at any point, it can affect the whole process.
It's a great analogy, and it shows why we need to think about preconception health in a much broader way. We need to think about all the interconnected factors that can affect those very early stages of development.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot today, from the tiniest cells all the way up to society as a whole.
We have.
We've talked about the science behind preconception health, what can affect it, and why it's so important for both partners to prepare. We even touched on some of the ethical questions around assisted reproductive technology and how healthcare providers can help promote preconception health.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting and multifaceted discussion.
It has. But before we wrap up, I want to bring up one more thing that we haven't really talked about directly, the mental and emotional well-being of the parents. We talked about how stress and anxiety can affect the developing embryo,
Right.
but I think it's also really important to acknowledge the emotional journey the parents go through.
It's true. Trying to conceive, whether it happens naturally or through art, can be incredibly emotional.
Right.
There are moments of excitement and anticipation,
Yeah.
but also moments of anxiety, uncertainty, and even grief if things don't work out.
And it's so important to acknowledge and validate all of those feelings.
It is. It's a reminder that preconception health isn't just about the physical body. It's about the whole person, mind, body, and spirit.
Absolutely. Supporting couples emotionally during this time is just as important as helping them physically prepare.
I couldn't agree more. We really need to create a culture where people feel comfortable talking about their experiences and asking for help when they need it.
I love that. Okay, so as we're getting close to the end of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one last question to think about.
Okay.
If you could design, like, the perfect periconception support system, what would it look like?
Ooh, that's a great question.
What resources or information would be most helpful to you on this journey?
Imagine a world where everyone, every couple trying to conceive, had access to really comprehensive care.
Yep.
Care that included things like personalized advice about diet and exercise,
Right.
stress management techniques, and how to avoid environmental hazards.
And doctors who are really up to date on all the latest research.
Exactly. Doctors who could really guide their patients and help them make the best choices for their situation.
What if we also lived in a society that really valued preconception health and put money into public health initiatives to make sure everyone has a healthy start from even before they're conceived?
It's a beautiful vision, isn't it?
It is. I know we're not quite there yet, but I think it's something worth working towards.
I agree. And even small changes can make a big difference. Every time we talk about this, every choice we make, every action we take to support preconception health, we're moving a little bit closer to that vision.
Well said. So to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has gotten you thinking about this in a new way.
We hope you feel empowered to take control of your own preconception journey.
Remember, knowledge is power. The more you know, the better choices you can make. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and stay curious. We'll see you on the next deep dive.
Wow, welcome back, everyone, for the last part of our deep dive on periconception health. This has been a really, really fascinating one, hasn't it?
It has. It really makes you think about family planning differently, that's for sure.
It does. I keep thinking about that phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. But I mean, this whole deep dive is really showing us that it also takes a village to create a child.
It does. We talk a lot about the choices that parents can make,
Right?
but we also have to think about the role of their healthcare providers, the environment, even society as a whole.
Right. It's just this really complex web of influences.
Yeah.
And I think it really highlights how important it is to look at periconception health holistically.
Oh, for sure.
Hmm.
One of the things that's really stuck with me from all of this is the concept of developmental plasticity.
Oh, yeah. That's a big one.
The idea that the environment can actually impact how the embryo's genes are expressed,
Hmm.
even in those really early stages.
Pretty amazing, isn't it?
It's wild. I mean, it's fascinating, but it's also kind of intimidating to think about. Like all the potential impacts our choices and even our surroundings could have.
It really makes you think about how important it is to create a nurturing and supportive environment, doesn't it?
Absolutely. For both parents, I mean, and the developing child.
Yeah.
And I'm not just talking about physical health, but emotional well-being too.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, that brings us back to something we touched on earlier, the emotional side of this whole journey.
Yeah,
Trying to conceive, whether it happens naturally or with art, can be really emotional.
it can. It really can.
There are ups and downs, excitement, anticipation,
Right.
but also anxiety, uncertainty, even grief if things don't work out.
And it's so important to just acknowledge all of those feelings.
It is. We need to make sure people feel comfortable talking about those feelings
Yeah,
and asking for help when they need it.
absolutely. It's all part of periconception health.
Hmm.
Okay, so as we're wrapping up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a question to think about.
Okay, I like it.
So if you could design the perfect periconception support system, what would it look like?
That's a good one.
What resources or information would be the most valuable to you on this journey?
Imagine a world where every single couple trying to conceive had access to amazing preconception care
Okay.
with personalized guidance on everything from nutrition and exercise to stress management and environmental health.
What if we also had healthcare providers who were really knowledgeable about the latest research
Hmm.
and could really support their patients' goals?
Yeah. And what if society as a whole really understood how important periconception health is and invested in public health to make sure everyone has the healthiest start possible?
Oh, that would be amazing.
Yeah,
It's a really beautiful vision.
it is.
We might not be there yet, but I think it's something worth aiming for.
I think so too. And I think even making small changes can get us closer to that goal.
Yeah.
Every time we talk about this, every choice we make, every action we take to support preconception health.
It all adds up.
It does.
So to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has really given you a new perspective on periconception health.
Yes. And we hope you feel empowered to take charge of your own journey.
Remember, knowledge is power. The more you know, the better choices you can make for yourself and your future family. So keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and stay curious. We'll see you on the next deep dive.